peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 of the Butterick 5951 sew along. Today we're going to be making the bodice and be making the skirt, so let's get started. As ever with one of my sew alongs, I am starting halfway through. So I'm going to put my skirt together first because it is slightly on the bias and I want to give it as much opportunity to drop if it's going to as possible. So I'm going to sew the skirt front sections together, then I'm going to sew the side seams to the skirt back portions, and I'm going to do all of that with French seams, and I'm going to finish the skirt back edge with bias binding. I have sewn the side seams and the centre front seam with the wrong sides together at 1/4 inch, and I'm going to trim this seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch so I can press it and finish sewing the French seams. Once I've done that, I'll then hang this up, and if there is any bias in the skirt it can drop. I've sewn the remainder of the French seams and these need to be pressed, and I've also sewn the bias binding to the wrong side of the skirt, so it's the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the skirt with the raw edges even, and I've sewn in the ditch, and I'm now going to wrap the binding around the raw edge to finish that off, and I've done that for both back edges of the back of the skirt. So I'll show you how I sew this down and then we can move on to the bodice. Okay, so I am using my blind hem foot because it has this little guide on it, and I've got my needle moved all the way over to the left. I don't pin my bias binding down. I find that I can get a better finish without it being pinned. So with my right forefinger I push the fabric and the binding flat, and I'd like to keep the rest of my hand, I keep this fabric nice and flat as well. And then with my left forefinger I push the binding flat, and I'm running this edge, this guide, along the edge of the binding, which is giving me a nice clean line of top stitching, which is securing the binding down and wrapping around the raw edge of the seam. This is the back seam, and just my preferred finishing method. You can totally overlock this edge, you could overcast this edge on your machine, you could pink this edge, whichever is your preferred finishing method for raw seams. I just like how French seams and bias binding look on the inside of a dress, and I like my insides to look pretty. So I'm going to finish off this seam. I've backstitched at the start and the end, and then I'm going to go and press the binding flat, and I'm also going to press the side seam, all the seams in one direction, because there's 2 side seams and the centre front seam, so I'm just going to press them all to the left, I think. I'm going to start working on the bodice now, so we're going to skip to step number 10 because I'm doing view B and C. So we want to reinforce inner corners of bodice front, pivoting at small circle, clip to the small circles, which is these tiny, this little bit here, and that's just so that we can release the collar and we can put gathering stitches in on the upper shoulder edges. It says we also want to slash dart along slash line to triangles as well. We want to slash our dart all the way up to here, then we're going to stitch and reinforce this area so that we can snip into this corner to release the seam allowance so that we can then put gathering stitches in this area. So before I took all my pins off, I've marked all the areas where I needed notches, these small circles for the gathering and for putting in the sleeve. I've marked in the point of my dart, the middle of my dart, and these 2 pieces of the dart here to help me get this dart sewn into place. And obviously I've marked in the notches and the side notches there as well. So I've slashed up to the triangle, and I have also slashed to, but not through, the stitching for the small dot at the collar and shoulder seams. So the next thing that it would like us to do is gather shoulder edges of bodice between the small circles and gather darts between small circles as shown. So it's the outer edges, the longer edges of the darts, and also the shoulders, and we're going to run 2 lines of gathering stitches along all of those, and I'm doing all of the same things to my lining and my bodice at the same time. They do tell you to prepare the lining in the same manner as the bodice and turn seam allowance on lower edge of lining in, but they tell you to do that after you've done all of these, so I just like to do everything at the same step on both outer and inner fabrics at the same time. So I'm going to sew my lines of gathering stitches in all the places marked, and then we can sew in our darts. So now that I've got my gathering stitches in, and if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I like to do a line of gathering stitches 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, and then another 3/8 of an inch away from that, which does put this second line of gathering stitches into the actual garment. So you want to test on a scrap piece of fabric to make sure that the fabric will recover from having holes in it, which this one does. So I have pinned up to the dart point here, and I have pinned at the bottom waist edge, and then I have pulled the gathers so that it meets or fits into the front bodice section nicely, and I've done that for both sides and for the outer and for the lining fabric. So I'm going to sew this, and I'm going to sew with the gathered side up, which means I'm going to have to sew from the point of the dart down to the waistline. So I'm going to just sew onto the fabric. I'm not going to backstitch at the dart because we're going to treat this the same way as we would any other dart. So I'm going to sew 5/8 of an inch the whole way down. I'm going to backstitch at the end here, and you can mark in your stitching lines if you want. The stitching line is on the pattern piece, but this is 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, so I'm going to stitch 5/8 of an inch away all from the raw edge along this gather. So I'm going to do that for the bodice and the lining for both gathers, so that's four darts in total. So when you're done, you should end up with something that looks like this and like this on the inside. So we're going to press these darts towards the center. You need to remove the gathering stitching that was visible in the bodice here, which I have done. So I'm going to do the same for my lining, and then I am going to work on the darts in the back bodice. As I mentioned, you don't want to backstitch at your dart point. You want to leave yourself some long thread tails so that you can tie a knot to finish off the dart, and you don't want to pull these too taut against the fabric either, because that will also give you a pucker or a dent in the end of your dart. You just want to secure those in place, and then we can snip off the excess thread, and as I say, we can remove the gathering stitches from the side that is visible on the outer bodice. Yeah, they will come out, but I'm having to kind of cut the threads to get the gathering stitches out, but you just want to remove those. Personally, I actually leave the other side in because I'm lazy, but it's up to you if you want to take those ones out as well. So I'm going to trim off the ends of the threads, do the same for the other side, and then we can work on the back bodice. I have sewn the gathered darts in the front, I've put the gathering section in the shoulders, and I have clipped into the corner here for the collar. The next step we're going to do is 13 stitch dart in bodice back, press towards center, and stay stitch neck edge. And so we're going to do that for the outer and the lining of our 4 back bodice pieces. You want to note that the dart on the back bodice piece is actually curved, and how I like to transfer the markings over from the pattern to the fabric is I snip into the ends of my darts, and I have already done this. I then put a pin through the point of the dart and mark that onto the fabric, and then with my French curve I put the curved edge of my French curve up against the dart, and I move it around until I find the correct place on the curve that accurately represents the dart. So I've got the 34 centimeter point at the top of my dart here, and as you can see, that curve on the French curve fits perfectly onto that dart. So I know that when I go to transfer the legs of the dart over to the fabric, if I put the 34cm point at the point of the dart on the fabric and match up the notch that I've made for the leg of the dart, then I will have an accurate curved dart. And then for the other side, you just flip it over and do exactly the same thing. So match up the 34, if it just happens to be the 34cm point on this French curve. Obviously different darts will have different points that you need to match up, but you just want to use the curved edge of your French curve to find the best place that fits into the curved dart to then transfer that over to the fabric. As I say, I've already done that. I did that as I was cutting it out because I was on a nice big flat surface. So you can see I've got my darts marked in here with friction pen. I have checked it does come off of this fabric. So I'm going to pin the darts in place and sew them, and then I'm going to stay stitch the back neckline. I have sewn my darts, and as ever I have sewn off of the edge because you don't want to back stitch at the point of a dart. We are going to, if I can get my threads apart, tie these into a knot to finish this off. You don't want to backstitch at the end of the dart because it will add bulk in that area, and you don't want to do that. So tie it in a couple of knots, and again you don't want to pull these too tight because you'll do the same thing. You'll kind of add tautness where you don't want it. So 3 knots, and then I'm going to trim off the excess, and then I have stay stitched the back neckline at 1/2 inch the whole way round, and this is going to help us get the collar of the front section onto the back section smoothly. At least that's the plan. So I'm going to trim off these excess threads, and then we can move on to that step. As ever, if you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!